We all face many storms in life. We all have fears in life. And I'll let you in on a little secret about life that we keep from ourselves and we keep from each other. We're all scared. We all aren't sure of things sometimes. And that was certainly the case with the Israelite army when they were facing Goliath's army, the Philistines. At that time in history, about 1000 BC approximately, the Philistines were about 25,000 strong, and they had a great army, and it was causing havoc with the Israelites. And the Philistines had a plan. They thought, well, we've won several wars with the Israelites, and we've won several battles, and maybe we can shame them into submission. Maybe we can fill their hearts with so much fear that they will just surrender to us. And we know they're afraid of Goliath. It's kind of hard to believe that Goliath was probably taller than I am. Right? I'm 6'4". Goliath is probably taller. Twice as heavy. And he had armor, 44 pounds of bronze armor, from what I figured after reading the weights and measures in the Bible. In today's measures, approximately 44 pounds of armor. He had a shield bearer go before him. This was at a time when most men in an army would be probably 5'4", 5'2". Most people were 5 feet, 5'2". So he would be a giant among them. He was an experienced soldier. He had been in the front lines of battle. He probably had killed several enemy soldiers. And it wasn't a pretty situation, a pretty sight in these battles. The armies would be on the field. They would move, one side would advance. Perhaps they would engage one another in battle for about 5 minutes or so. Many people would die in that process, and it would be Goliath's job to kill as many enemy soldiers as possible, and he'd do that by creating puncture wounds. He wouldn't have to kill them outright on the battlefield. He'd just have to stab them somewhere in the upper body. And if you're almost 7 feet tall, and if you've got a reach that's twice as far as the next guy, okay, you're going to have an advantage, aren't you? And so the dead and dying would be left in agony on the battlefield. Goliath walks proudly off with his regiment, ready for the next engagement. And they worshipped 25 gods with a small g, maybe more, one of which was Baal, and they laughed at Israel. Right, one God, only one God. But something about that one God infuriated them. They wanted this battle finished. They wanted it ended. And the Israelites were a little shell-shocked, all right, to use a modern term. They were shocked by this situation. Into into the fray steps this kid who's about 17 or 18 years old. And his name, what was his name? David? Wasn't he the 8th son of Jesse? This guy Samuel chosen. All right. Anyway, this kid, David, has the audacity to show up on the battlefield. He must have been kind of persuasive because he gets the ear of Saul, the king of Israel, and says, Saul, put me in battle with one-on-one with this Goliath guy. What? Are you kidding? What do you mean? He'll kill you outright. You're just committing suicide. But David has a strategy. He's actually going to outsmart Goliath. You see, God prepares those who follow him. God prepares those who are afraid. God prepares those who are just like you and me. David was the 8th son of Jesse, and David was a shepherd. And when he was out in the field, sometimes he faced life and death situations. If he was going to be a good shepherd, if he was going to do his father proud, he was going to maintain that flock. He wasn't going to lose any of the flock to a wild bear, for example. And sometimes a wild bear would appear. And it would be his responsibility to fight off that bear. And wild bears don't like being fought. All right? They see some puny human being, they're going to want to tear him limb from limb. But David won the battle, even though he was terrified. Because, in some way, he found a way. And he found a slingshot, and he found stones of the right size, and he practiced the slingshot. And he knew where to hit the bear in the head. It would not be cold. And then he knew later, within seconds, to be upon the bear and cut its throat. That was a good strategy. That was something that was going to work against this. And then one day it says in the book of Samuel, he faced a lion. I don't know, I've seen lions in African lion safari and other places, and intimidating isn't the word, okay? A lion in the wild, this is what he had to face. I'm terrified just thinking about it. But he faced it, and he won. And so, when the moment arrived, when Goliath was on the battlefield, and Israel was in terror, he knew what the answer is. So, by the grace of God, he faced Goliath. And we know the outcome. Goliath was killed. Got hit in the head with a stone, fell face forward. David goes and cuts his head off. That is a miracle in a way. It's also a very violent story. Sometimes life is difficult. We have to remember that the knowledge of God was growing in the world. And unfortunately, sometimes there is conflict, but as things progress, we can and are, and in our time, must be more peaceful. It's not acceptable to cut off the heads of our enemies in 2012. We must find a way, a more peaceful way, to get along with one another. After all, it is 3,000 years further on down the pipe, isn't it? Which brings me to the next story. It's repeated actually in Matthew as well as Mark. In Matthew has Jesus walk across the water to meet the disciples in the boat. Can you imagine? Now, these scenes in the Bible, they bring forward a flood of emotion, especially in our time, right? The first emotion in many people is, yeah, right, sure. Okay, so we walked across the water. All right, I'm really going to believe that. I'm not here to tell you that he actually did walk across the water or he actually did calm the storm. I'm not going to insist that you believe that, erstwhile you're not a Christian. I'm not going to say that. I have a hard time believing it. But I am not going to say that it didn't actually happen. I am going to say that that whole argument is beside the point. The real point is that we must have faith. We must have faith in the power of peace. We must have faith in the power of God. And the reason why the disciples were so astounded was because he calmed the storm. The storms in their own lives, the storms in their own hearts, the storms in their own communities were calmed by the power of God. That was another miracle. Merely 1,000 years after David's confrontation with Goliath. We're making progress here, right? We're making progress. And then comes God's apostle, the Apostle Paul, and he's writing to the Corinthians. It's his second letter to the Corinthians, and he's getting a little bit desperate by this time because he's had competition in Corinth for the ear of the people. Not everybody believes that what Paul is doing is right, and he has to reaffirm his qualifications as an apostle. Right? Now, what does he say about those qualifications? Does he say, I have the ear of Caesar, I am Caesar's son, or I am in line to be the governor of Corinth, or the mayor of Corinth? No, he doesn't say that. He says, I've been whipped, I've been beaten, I've been disgraced. These are my credentials as a prophet. These are my credentials as an apostle. This is why you should listen to me. Sounds very counterintuitive. But these are the ways of the world. Sometimes, out of the most confounding situations, the peace of God is heard, and the peace of God is among us. And 2,000 years later, he must have been right, because 2,000 years later, we still read the Apostle Paul every day. Every day. And so may the peace of God, which passeth all understanding, be in your hearts and minds, now and forever. In Jesus' name. God bless you all.